Hello and welcome to The Holistic Capitalist. Our topic today is Obama Revealed, a dialogical exercise. I don't know about you, but President Obama has always been a problematic figure for me. While I didn't vote for him, I admired his amazing communication skills and, as an advocate of dialogue, looked forward to his commitment to create the most transparent administration in history. And who could not thrill at the accomplishment of the American people for voting in the first African-American president? Very quickly, however, it became clear to me that the Obama presidency would take Washington's spin to a new level. It has also proven to be one of the most secretive, according to a recent article by Margaret Sullivan called "Obama Promised Transparency, but His Administration is one of the most secretive," and this article was filed in the Washington Post. Are the conspiracy theories true? After I began to recognize that transparency had given way to secrecy, I started hearing about all kinds of conspiracy theories. These ranged from the birther issue, which was a little silly, to the more serious and interesting hypothesis put forth in the 2012 documentary by Dinesh D'Souza and John Sullivan, with the provocative title, Obama's America. Love him? Hate him? You don't know him. Its main theme was that Obama's cross-cultural and cross-racial upbringing led him to see a path for America that could defeat the vestiges of colonialism which were hanging around the world. These colonial vestiges, from Obama's view, could be witnessed in the investment and financial practices of multinational capitalist companies. This documentary further alleged Obama sees capitalism as some sort of deliberate ideology to keep third world countries in a lesser status for purposes of exploitation, and that he is willing to be disloyal to American interests to correct this. This all seemed like an extreme right-wing conspiracy thesis to me, though it did have some documented research behind it. And interestingly, probably the best research were quotations from Obama's own books. Now, dialogical thinking is a sort of pre-dialogue mindset practice that helps anticipate and imagine into different points of view. Since I place such great value on the practice of dialogue and dialogical thinking, Obama has become one of my favorite characters to practice dialogical methods on. I set out to apply the basic dialogue standard, everyone's point of view feels reasonable to them, until I could get a reasonable picture of where Obama is coming from. Now, this is so important because the standard continues, not only do you need to understand everyone's point of view as reasonable to them, but if you can't feel that, then it only means one thing ever and one thing only. You don't get it yet. I first focused on some of the perplexing actions I witnessed coming from the White House. I think the first of these for me occurred with the economic crisis and the somewhat lackadaisical urgency for recovery, job creation, and support for businesses that were just trying to survive the meltdown. Obama's social agenda was clearly of much greater importance to him than bolstering the success of capitalism or relieving the economic suffering of many Americans, or so it appeared to me. Another has been the consistent refusal of President Obama to reference radical Islamic terrorism. And yet, he has gone farther than any American president to build relationships with the Muslim world. And most recently, sending a plane load of cash without congressional oversight to Iran, a country that is reputed to be a state sponsor of terrorism. My challenge has been to figure out what framework could truly explain all of these actions and more as reasonable to him. How can Obama's vision be reasonable to him? Relying on my international experience and using my best effort at dialogical thinking, I was at least able to approach how all this could feel reasonable to Mr. Obama. I recalled a strategy consulting trip I made to South Africa shortly after the end of the horrific doctrine of apartheid. The company I worked for was socially responsible and got out of their investments in South Africa during apartheid, but now they were returning. I noticed that there seemed to be some local car models in the country and asked my guide about them. I had expected everything would just be imports. I was told that there was indeed an automobile manufacturing industry there, but they were all kit cars. This meant that most of the subassemblies were sent into the country in crates and assembled. My guide explained the local theory that kit cars is a carefully managed sales strategy to avoid trade tariffs, which were based on content percentage, and yet also avoid the very deep capital investment necessary to develop the industrial infrastructure enough to have a complete supply chain capability in South Africa. As I said before, I personally never quite bought into the conspiracy theories. Some going so far as to allege that Obama was a secret terrorist sympathizer or even a terrorist himself. That seemed pretty ridiculous. Yet his outreach and determined efforts to forge relationships and dialogue with Muslim-based countries was very obvious. He seemed to persist even when it was less than prudent, from a short-term view at least, to America's interests, and certainly to his own political capital. Contrary to many of my peers, I greatly admired Obama's effort at dialogue with Islamic leaders, which went way beyond anything that any American leader has attempted. I will always maintain that in a holistic philosophy, dialogue between any polarity is always worth the effort and never to be feared. This Muslim outreach was, for me, one of the threads that gave me glimpses of what Obama's framework just might be. But I did wish I had more transparent disclosure from Obama to help me put all of his unique geopolitical initiatives into a more complete, reasonable framework that would lead me to a dialogical connection, even if it didn't lead to complete agreement. Then I listened to President Obama's September 20, 2016 final address to the United Nations, and I felt like the veil preventing dialogue connection fell away. For the first time in 8 years, it seemed like Barack Obama was talking without Washington rope-a-dope spin. Maybe it's because he was at the end of his presidency and thought he had nothing to lose. Maybe I had just been missing it. I don't know. But here are the 5 salient things I heard from his point of view. 1. Now that communism has been defeated, the last influences of colonialism must also be extinguished. It was interesting to hear him say that from his own mouth. 2. Anytime there are polarities in the world of this or that nation, this or that sect, haves and have-nots, this or that race, this or that religion, there will be tensions in the world that will lead to conflict and sometimes war. At first, he avoided gender equality, which was agitating me quite a bit, given how much ideological-driven gender discrimination exists in many of the countries in the room where he was giving his speech. But finally, in dramatic fashion, and I'm sure he planned it this way, he included gender and also sexual preference in the list of polarities as well, all of which he believes must be overcome. And who can disagree? His third salient point, from his point of view, using diplomacy to explore and resolve such polarizations is essential if the world is ever to be a unified, peaceful place where all can thrive. His fourth insight, or fourth point, nations, including the United States, must be willing to surrender some small measure of sovereignty by giving up some freedom of action and binding ourselves to international rules and an international judiciary. 5. Soulless capitalism. Yes, he used that term. Soulless capitalism must be replaced by something more enlightened and holistic in its interests. And I smiled. I could finally see his worldview as reasonable to him. I always love the feeling in that moment when the connection is made. To be honest, for me, it's a deeply spiritual experience. And in my heart of hearts, as I pondered his speech, I had to admit that my expanded understanding changed me. That's actually one of the signs when real dialogue brings both ends of a polarity into a shared space. It doesn't always happen with this dialogical exercise, but even then, even though it's not a true dialogue because the other party isn't in the room, it can bring you to that point. What was the synergistic change I arrived at from this dialogic? It actually left me agreeing with Obama's long-term vision, although retaining a strong disagreement on his strategy or path to achieving it. His vision led to reasonable to him White House actions that were previously not comprehensible to many, and certainly not to me. For example, sending pallets full of cash to a country said to fund terrorism and a government that was not the actual government that the original deal, in which the U.S. allegedly owed the money, was based on. Why in the world did this happen in the dead of night without congressional oversight? Was the birther conspiracy true after all? Was Obama really a terrorist? Was he really disloyal to the U.S. as an American president? No, none of these. Per the dialogic insight, he believes in a greater holism for the world, based on equality and international law. Per the insight, he took the rather unusual moment with Iran to set an example to the rest of the world that America would submit a degree of sovereignty in a nod to international law, and thereby uphold the agreement. Why avoid radical Islamic terrorism as a phrase? Per the dialogue insight, which seeks to find a place that feels reasonable in a polarity, because it could detract from the dialogue he was trying to build between the non-Islamic world and non-radicalized Islam, which, after all, Islam is a religious and cultural ideology encompassing 23% of the population of the entire world. Any pragmatic strategic agenda cannot ignore a quarter of the world. What I am left disagreeing with is the execution. I don't believe that sending a plane load of cash without congressional oversight to a country accused of sponsoring terrorism was the best opportunity to set the example regarding international law. I'm quite sure other examples could have been found. Maybe not as dramatic, and maybe that was his point. I also don't believe that lowering transparency to his own citizenry about his true intentions demonstrates great leadership. For me, great leadership always seeks to engage people in a worthy vision. If it has to keep it secret from them to work, it may not be ethical. I also don't believe that the U.S. must see jobs and prosperity drained to address the inequalities attached to so many of the policies or the polarities that Obama addressed in his UN speech. This is where I believe he deviated from a holistic philosophy and turned into a blind alley of reductionist thought. With his vision in mind, nevertheless, governments and capitalists could shape the world without necessarily diminishing our democratically established social laws and policies or the prosperity of capitalist organizations. The execution, however, must be much, much better. How can the execution be better? Well, by no means am I a geopolitical strategist. However, in lean manufacturing, it is currently in vogue to create lighthouses. These are examples of lean culture tools and organizational support structures that seek to make an area highly successful and because of that desirable to other employees so that they will want to strive toward achieving the same standards and principles. This does not involve diminishing the lighthouse to bring others up. In fact, doing so would diminish the lighthouse and its desirability. How does this apply? Well, failing to stand strongly for women's rights across the world, even with Islamic nations, is not necessary to a sustained dialogue. Avoiding differentiation between democracy and an ideology, namely radical Islamic terrorism, that imposes its beliefs entitled Sharia law in a totalitarian fashion is not necessary to sustain a dialogue. We must maintain the standard. What is needed is more and more dialogue with mainstream Islam without lowering our hard-won principles. America must always strive to be the lighthouse. To be sure, some changes and risks in international diplomacy and capital investment strategies will be necessary to effectively execute Obama's geopolitical vision. However, this cannot be done at the wholesale expense of one nation or the other or over another. And this is true of either direction, whichever nation we're talking about. In dialogue, the best contributions of both polarities become baked into the emerging holism between the two poles as mutual common ground understanding emerges. If this doesn't happen, the vision of holism and peace will never become a reality. Can holistic capitalism and holistic geopolitical policies and diplomacy move the world towards Obama's vision and change the paradigm? I think so. But it must be done by enlarging the pie, not by cutting the pie into smaller and smaller pieces for all. Just as it cannot be done by enlarging the pie with all the growth flowing to the biggest pieces of the previous traditional incarnation of the pie. Well, that's our episode for today. This is the first of what I hope will become a series of dialogical exercises. I have other videos to come out soon which will go much deeper in explaining dialogue and the process of dialogue. But I hope to do these dialogical exercises every now and then on different topics as current events present themselves with the challenge to step out of our own framework and imagine the reasonableness of someone else's. Thank you for listening.